Hello, everyone. I'm Carl Phillips. I have the honor of leading today's service. The theme of the service is acts of creation as acts of faith, particularly our own acts of creation. It will be a journey through creations and notions of creation. I wonder what is in our wonder box today. It's a decked out Winnie the Pooh stuffy. Those of you with photographic memories might recognize it from about that point on my shelf normally. I know if Laurel's here, she will. She comments on it every time. Today I'll be featuring some acts of creation that are easy to recognize as acts of creation, but this represents another concept I want to talk about. The combinations we create in our lives of things that we may not create individually, but are themselves perhaps our most important acts of creation. This is a bit different from some Wonderbox stories, but bear with me, because it's really also part of the sermon. I don't recall how exactly I got the doll itself. I believe it was a cutesy gift from a girl sometime around age 17. A girl I married, sadly temporarily, 34 years ago today, but that's not today's story. The point is that it wasn't a childhood toy. It had no particular gravitas for me, well, until it did. The shirt here is more significant. The childhood bear of a friend of mine, one of my teammates on our college speech and debate team, was our team mascot. Someone, and I think it was me, bought a college logo shirt for the bear, Ohio State Buckeyes, if you can't see it. When my friend graduated and moved on, her childhood bear was his name, of course, and she took Bear with her, and I inherited the shirt, and thus Winnie the Pooh here got it. So with that act of combination, without much thought, and certainly never anticipating decades of appearances on my scholarly bookshelves, I created something of lasting significance, at least for my teammates for a few years, and myself for much longer. In my last year on the team, I qualified to compete in the National Oratory Championships, which were in Colorado, which was pretty exciting, and I just mean the Colorado part. It was about the furthest I had ever traveled, and maybe the 5th time I had ever been on an airplane. So this button, Colorado, commemorates that trip. After the tournament, my coach's teammate and I had just enough time to drive up Pikes Peak, thus this button, because that, of course, is what Ohioans do with a spare day in Colorado. It was really quite an amazing experience. I'm actually told that I had done that drive once before, but I was in utero at the time and don't really remember it well. And with that, a couple of mass-produced buttons, a mass-produced shirt, and doll created an object of lasting significance. A few years later, I had the opportunity to travel in South and Central Asia and acquired these prayer beads from a street vendor. They have a specific original meaning, which I won't go into, but I adopted them more as a chain of connection to places and times and the faiths of the world that we can learn from. I'm not really much for rosaries per se. This rounded out this creation of a physical artifact of my personal journey, the spiritual and the worldly, fierce striving and competition alongside the search for calm and peace. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I did win that national championship. I'll admit I'm not sure the journey alone would have kept this on my shelf for decades without it also serving as a trophy. I wonder where you found yourself in this story. Perhaps you thought of a tableau of mundane objects you have, whose juxtaposition feels to you like a great act of creation. And if you feel that, it is. Perhaps you have a mantelpiece or a display shelf or a bulletin board that could generate a story like this. And if so, I'm sure a lot of us would love to hear it. Perhaps you thought about your own acts of creation that blended your worldly and spiritual lives. Perhaps you're just like Winnie the Pooh. Those of you who saw the presentation of statements of faith and credos from the adult coming of age class Might recall that I talked about how I came to realize that for me, every act of creation is an act of faith. I spoke of entropy and order, evolution and communitarianism. I told about how I feel in my spirit that creating something of quality, even if it serves no material purpose, and even if it's something hardly anyone will notice, is an act of faith. But it's better if we do notice. Recall that triangle of faith, spirituality, and religion that our church leaders started exploring with us this year. It's all good to engage in solo spiritual creativeness, but there's something wonderful about making it part of religion, our collective activity too. I'm pretty sure I've never shared that full story of the Winnie the Pooh with anyone before, and it was really great to do. In that spirit, I present you with some of the images and thoughts that some of you sent me to use in this service. Eileen crochet's prayer or comfort shawls for people in hospice. The chaplain there tells the recipient that there is a prayer in every stitch. To help deal with the pandemic winter, Jerry made this spring-themed fairy lantern. She says she finds faith in nature and this creation embodies the beauty of the natural world. It helped remind her that COVID-19 did not have the power to stop the coming of spring. Jan made this creation this spring, etching the image into a sand cast and then pouring in molten metal. She made it to capture the beauty, inspiration, and tranquility of nature. Ellen, like many of you, creates in her garden and says plants of all type are an inspiration to her. She then goes on to turn that creation into further creation, fabric prints like this, which she will then sew into a quilt. It's a wonderful blending of the ephemeral and the lasting. Sarah's painting, entitled Union Square West, comes with quite a story. She started it in 2015, but the day after she completed the gold dome at about this stage, she suffered a concussion that made it impossible for her to continue with the required detail and straight lines. She revisited it several times over the years, getting closer to the creation she wanted. And this year, Sarah honored our Acts of Creation service by taking our invitation as an inspiration to finish it. Members of our congregation also bring us great performative acts of creation. We see that every week with our wonderful choir and musicians. And some of you have seen our unofficial poet in residence, Roy Goodman, reading his poetry during our Poetry as a Spiritual Practice group or elsewhere. Here is Roy reciting one of his poems, one that itself is about what is perhaps society's most important creative act. You can find more of his work via the link that we'll put in the chat.
Harvest. We stopped after walking all day into the wind. Rest well tonight, they said, for tomorrow we begin the sacred harvest, the harvest that must take place before the first planting. What could it mean? How could we reap before we have sown? It will be days of hard work, the eldest said, so rest well. We could not sleep, my brothers and I. We talked about this strange riddle as we huddled together in the straw of our flimsy shelter, pressed against the gentle slope that rose from the top of the cliff face to the horizon and the stars. Our teeth chattered in the cold. Winter was still with us, and though the days now were longer and brighter, we were yet 2 Sundays from the equinox and the festivals that would follow. What is there to gather in this unsheltered field, with its low grasses and still dormant herbs and flowers? Perhaps we will gather these, perhaps the strongest medicine lies in their potential, said one. But that is easy work, said another. I have dug up roots and clipped leaves and twigs since I was smaller than a lamb. They said we would have hard work. I lay in silence between my brothers. I did not know what to say. They argued as I fell asleep. I dreamed of the land which cradled me. I saw a field of oats leaning in the wind, and I saw our holy place, built of stone, on a low hill above the oats. I woke up knowing the answer to the riddle. We must gather stones to clear the field for planting. We must harvest stones to build our homes and to build our sacred places. It is hard work.
Creations that what we all might normally call works of art are amazing. And I can't imagine how many hours I could spend taking in all of these creations just from this group. But I also want to broaden the notion of faith filled creation to be more inclusive. Not all of us do painting, drawing, singing, writing for public consumption, but we are all creative engines. Dave Price has assembled a collection of photographs, many of which are art by themselves, I think. But as with the Winnie the Pooh, it's the collection itself and what it represents that he focuses on in this.
Hi, this is Dave Price. One of my favorite acts of creation is posting video and photo galleries of bike rides with my wife Jessica. We bought e-bikes in 2016 and average about 500 miles every year. One web page links together all of the galleries, and each gallery brings together the memories of each ride. These galleries not only represent the acts of creating the photos and videos, but more important is the creation of memories of the favorite activity that Jessica and I enjoy doing together. One of our favorite bike rides was riding on top of the 8-mile wall around the ancient city of Shan in China. If you'd like to view our Bicycle Galleries page, I believe Carl will make the web address available.
I found myself thinking about the creations of spiders and the creations of ants. The spider creates something that we often call art, though I doubt she thinks of it that way. The ants, and note the plural ants and the singular spider here, create something far more impressive, which few of us take much time to marvel at. Something no ant, singular, could ever create, nor would a solitary creature be inclined to do so. Individual creations are a wonder. Much of what appeared in this service were individual efforts juxtaposed together. But were they really? Were they really individual efforts? Roy and I are able to write our particular words, words that people want to read and hear, because of those who wrote the words that inspired us and those who taught us in one way or another. We can only share them with thousands of others because of our community's collective efforts to create a shared understanding of language, background, metaphor, to say nothing of the books and other media of transmission themselves. Jed and our choir create wonderful pieces of music that we have enjoyed today and every Sunday, but they're also standing on the shoulders of composers of the song and the creators of the instruments, who themselves are standing on the shoulders that go back to when some early Homo sapien banged a couple of things together and thought, that sounds nice. Great visual art is not unlike my making of the Winnie the Pooh montage. The inputs are fairly mundane objects made easily available thanks to humanity's collective creations. Someone created the paint and the cloth, after all. Sure, we can each create our own materials to facilitate our further creations, and probably some of you are thinking about times you did that and the extra satisfaction that that brought. But consider also finding extra satisfaction in what somebody else created for you to create further in ways that you otherwise could not. It's easy to pursue the thinking, the evil Disney Corporation created that particular visage for Winnie the Pooh and sold it to someone for profit who gave it to me. It's harder, but possibly more fulfilling to think a person sewed that Winnie the Pooh doll. And it was only when I was writing this that I realized that that creator was probably somewhere in South Asia, and I closed a loop by adding those prayer beads. Yeah, sure, it's unlikely that they were thinking of their time in the toy factory as an act of faith, probably more an act of survival. The anthill metaphor is sometimes a little too apt for the human condition. But still, we can take the time to appreciate the creation of the paints, the yarn, the other tools we use. I know this might start to sound like the rote act of thanking some ineffable God for the bounty we are about to enjoy before our meal, but we don't need to posit a creative God when we can instead stop and appreciate seeing that we're surrounded by creative forces of nature, a creative biosphere, and the creative acts of volition of the community of humanity. If, like me, you feel like acts of creation are acts of faith, I urge you to hold on to that feeling, exercise it whenever you can, but also expand it. We end this service, but not the individual and collective spiritual creativity that made it possible. I unlight and disassemble this chalice, but we can be sure that this is a preparation for a future act of creation. Go forth and appreciate all of your creative artifacts, acts, and combinations, and the mutual joy that comes from sharing them. Blessed be, and amen.